One of the features of the EASD program is always the outcomes of major trials. And I'm delighted to have with us in the studio Matthew Cavender from the University of North Carolina, who's going to talk us through the outcomes of the SOUL trial. So first of all, the SOUL trial. All these acronyms, rather kind of contrived acronyms, but tell us about the SOUL trial.
Well, thanks so much for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about what I think is really an important study. You know, the SOUL trial evaluated oral semaglutide, which is a GLP-1 receptor agonist, and we've had multiple studies that have looked at the subcutaneous form, but there's a real desire to have an oral option for patients. And so there were a couple of questions. You know, one was, did the oral formulation reduce cardiovascular events like we've seen in some of the other studies? And so it was on that basis that the SOUL trial was designed. We took over 8,000 patients. All of them had type 2 diabetes. The majority of them had some sort of atherosclerotic disease. They either had coronary disease, they had cerebrovascular disease, they had PAD. A small proportion of them also could have gotten in on the basis of a diagnosis of chronic kidney disease, about 15% of the patients. And those patients were randomized either to oral semaglutide or placebo. We followed them over time, and the primary endpoint of the study was cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, or stroke.
And what was the impact?
Yeah, so oral semaglutide reduced the composite of cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, or stroke by about 14% in patients with high risk of atherosclerotic disease. We showed that, and it was presented at the ACC meeting in 2025, and we published it in the New England Journal.
So it's interesting, isn't it? Because some time ago, we would have been talking about semaglutide really in relation to its diabetes. And now we're talking about it in relation to its cardiovascular outcomes. I mean, and when we now accept that, but that's been really quite a change, hasn't it? That we're just thinking about this in much broader terms than we originally did.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, when the LEADER trial came out, which was really the first cardiovascular outcome trial of GLP-1 receptor agonist, it really set the stage for all the data yet to come. And it has been quite impressive. As you've seen the multiple different disease states, the multiple different outcomes and endpoints that GLP-1 receptor agonists impact. For me as a cardiologist, I'm obviously mostly interested in the cardiovascular effects of it, but to be honest, they're all intertwined. The effects of on sleep apnea and orthopedic issues and PAD and cardiovascular issues are really all intertwined.
So what does the outcome of the SOUL trial mean, first of all, for the clinician? So let's divide that into two. Let's talk about, first of all, the diabetologist.
Yeah. Well, I think that, you know, the oral formulation, I think, is a big advance. The reality of it is that while the subcutaneous forms are tolerated by many people, there are populations of people who just really aren't interested in taking the subcutaneous form. And so having an oral option, I think, is a very important contribution, not only for patients with diabetes, but also from the cardiovascular risk prevention. So for diabetes, we found that it was, you know, highly effective. That's been relatively well known. The oral formulation has been approved for the treatment of diabetes now for many years and has been shown to be as effective as the subcutaneous forms. I think the question was, how would that translate into cardiovascular outcomes? And that's the question that we answered in the SOUL trial. And we showed, in my mind at least, convincingly that the oral formulation reduces cardiovascular events in patients that were extremely high risk of them.
So the diabetologists, I take from that, can be assured that actually oral is as good as the subcutaneous. That's one takeaway. Yeah. But another takeaway, of course, is that, you know, potentially the oral forms should become cheaper because they're not injectable. They can be stored at ambient temperatures, you know, all those kind of things, and they might have more utility, be more available to a broader population. So there are kind of quite a lot of advantages there.
Yeah, you know, we've done meta-analyses, and Darren McGuire, a good friend and colleague of mine, published one in JAMA Cardiology earlier this year, where he looked at the SOUL trial in relationship to the other GLP-1 receptor agonists, all of which up to this time were subcutaneous formulations. And the point estimate for the SOUL trial falls essentially right on line with the other forms. So I think to answer your question, absolutely, it seems that the subcutaneous form, at least with respect respect to cardiovascular outcomes is as good as those other formulations.
Now, let me ask the question again, but from the point of view of the cardiologists, because we all hope that cardiologists and diabetologists work as a team, but sometimes that doesn't always happen. What should the cardiologists be taking from this trial to tell their diabetologist colleagues?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think in the current era we see that patients are complex. They have multiple comorbidities, and really taking a team approach to care is really what you need. You need to have the engagement of your primary care physicians, your nephrologist, your endocrinologist, and the cardiologist. So I think from the cardiologist perspective, I think what we need to do is make sure that we get on patients on evidence-based therapies, irrespective of who's doing that, whether it be the primary care physicians, the diabetologist, or the cardiologist. I think all need to feel enabled to utilize these evidence-based therapies. The latest EASD guidelines for cardiovascular risk reduction in patients with diabetes support both the initiation of SGLT2 inhibitors, which have also been used frequently in the treatment of patients with diabetes, as well as GLP-1 receptor agonists. So I think the takeaway is that we need to utilize these medicines. We need to figure out ways to get patients on them. There are multiple reasons why patients aren't on them, and we need to try to figure out how to overcome those barriers.
Yeah, because sometimes you have kind of two teams fighting each other, and you need. Here we've got essentially a single-purpose medicine, and actually to knock off two things, as it were, with one medicine is actually probably better for the patient than having separate prescriptions for separate things.
Yeah. Well, I'm lucky to work at a place where I think that there's a lot of collegiality between sort of the different specialties. And John Buse and Clara Klein are two of my colleagues who are here today from the endocrinology perspective. And so I think more and more you're seeing synergy between specialties. And I think there really is this kind of team-based care where really the goal is trying to get these patients on evidence-based therapies. And you're right, the effects are appearing to be broad-based and affecting multiple different things. But at the end of the day, they all are interrelated. One
ring to rule them all.
Yeah, that's right.
Indeed. So it's often we don't see cardiologists very much at EASD. I'm delighted that we've had such an influx of cardiologists, and thank you so much for telling us about the SOUL trial. It really is a big marker, I think, for future treatment. Thank you so much. Okay, there'll be more from EASD TV very soon.